So I've taken some code that I built for one particular customer, for one particular implementation of hardware asset management. And that's sort of what I'll use as an example of how I structure my code, which a lot of it goes to what I'll mention in these few slides. So cool, let's get started. So this is about organizing script includes. I know we have a very, very wide range of skill sets in this meeting. So it's going to start very basic and it's going to move up from there. Like, here's our agenda. So I have a quick disclaimer that I'll put out there that's just about these are my opinions. So not necessarily are these any sort of golden book. I'll give a definition of what script includes are. I'll talk about why, sort of the purpose of organizing your script includes and why it's best practice and why they should be organized in a meaningful way. And then we'll go over just some principles to help you keep your code, things to think about to help you keep your code as organized as possible whenever you're building it. Hopefully I can field questions throughout because I want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you have questions or if you need clarification, please just let me know during the session and we can start conversations as we go. All right, so like I said, quick disclaimer, it's going to be an opinionated session. So these are my opinions. A lot of this is just my opinion. So please don't take offense if I present an idea that you may not fully agree with. I don't think anyone would take offense, but I just don't want you to think that I'm saying this is the only way. So what we're doing here is giving you ideas and telling you what's worked for me over the years, right? I'm going to do my best to explain it as we go through how I sort of got to all of my thoughts and opinions and ideas. But, if I miss something, please feel free for me to, to ask me to clarify. And you can always reach out to me after this, please. I mean, a lot of you reach out to me all the time anyway. So, but if you need to reach out to me for anything, please just let me know. So we'll start with the definition. Like I said, very, very basic of script includes, right? So what is a script include? And this is a question that I had my first day in ServiceNow. Like, I had no idea what a script include was. I was told to go build a script include and sort of how to use it and that it was server side, but I didn't realize that what it really is a place like a repository for your code, right? So you can think of that as a file system of code files if you were hosting your own web. So script includes are the server side of all of that. So very simply, they are records that contain JavaScript that runs on the server. I don't differentiate here what type of JavaScript. It's just some JavaScript that will run on the server. It can be something as simple as a single function, or it can be a gigantic class of functions. Some of the stuff ServiceNow builds runs that entire spectrum. I personally don't believe script include should ever be one function. I don't like that idea because I think script include should, again, they're the cornerstone of your organization, of your code in the platform. So calling one function from a script include, that function likely belongs somewhere and it doesn't belong by itself, right? It likely is part of a bigger idea and belongs in a class or another script include that helps express that idea. Cool, script includes can also be called from client scripts, right? But they're called through Glide Ajax. So Glide Ajax sends the parameters that you pass into it to the server, gets the information from the server, and then passes that back out to you to go to the client. So, Ajax should always be run asynchronously. In fact, in apps now, you cannot run Glide Ajax asynchronously, but you used to be able to, and you still can in global, even though it's not documented, you can still do get XML wait, which will allow it to be synchronous. Sometimes that's useful, but most times it's not. And then script includes, just try to think of them, like I said, as the primary building block of reusable code in ServiceNow, right? So there's client-side stuff too, and there's UI scripts that we can build that act sort of like script includes, but script includes are really the core of everything because we do most of our processing, most of our data crunching on the server, not on the client. So yeah, and script includes being that they run on the server. For those of you that don't understand what that means really, is that, server side is basically it gets compiled into Java using the Rhino engine. And that Java then runs on the server, on the servers that ServiceNow hosts their instances on. So the APIs are slightly different than what you have available to you on the client. Client is based on the browser. So if I'm in Chrome, I may have the latest and greatest. And if I'm in IE, I know I don't have the latest and greatest. So the APIs are a little bit different even between clients, but they're definitely different between clients and the server. Now, ES5, ECMAScript 5 is the official latest code that is supported on the server, but there is some support for ES6. right? Like I think includes is one of those that is an ES6 function that you can use within the ES5 server code, because they've done some polyfills, which polyfills are just functions that ServiceNow may have added, or we could even add them, but they're added to that server code base to be used sort of to backfill things that have not been implemented in the server Rhino engine yet. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so that's the definition of script include. Just a record, just holds JavaScript. That JavaScript loads and runs on the server. So purpose, right, of organizing script includes. A lot of times I show people things that I've built, like script include wise, like libraries that I built for implementations, and people are shocked at how many script includes I may create. Well, I have a core belief in one of these principles that we're about to mention, the DRY principle, do not repeat yourself principle, right? So that's one of them. Code should be defined one time in one place. Anytime that code needs to be used, it's referenced from that one place. So if for some reason I need to change that functionality in the future, I come and change it in one place rather than 50 places. So if I need, even if I'm in a business rule and I need something as simple as let me get the current user's phone number, well, that is a theme, right? That likely could be put into a script include about users that allows me to get information about users and could be reused in the future if I ever need to get a phone number again. So rather than putting a function or even doing an inline glide record call within that business rule, it's always going to be best practice to say, let me go ahead and create a script include for that, right? First, before I create that script include, let me search the script includes to see if somebody else has already created that one, or if ServiceNow already has a util that does that for me too, right? So lots and lots of script includes get created. Some of them are very small and only have a couple functions, one or two functions. Some of them are larger. And I'll kind of show you a good example of that with the library that I have that I'm going to show everyone. So anyway, do not repeat yourself. So when this is adhered to really, really strictly, you can see how it helps reduce defects as well as development effort, right? So as an architect of a project, if I am working with a couple of TCs and I sort of lay out how we're going to structure the code in that implementation, and I tell them, hey, I've already got a function that handles these things that you're probably going to have to do in this workflow. Well, now they can just go to that, grab that function and use that within their workflow every time that they need to get a certain piece of information. So that's how it reduces efforts. And when you're maintaining in the future, because we end up maintaining most of our solutions, right? Most of our implementations and solutions. So it helps us in the future as well as we carry on. The time that it takes to step away and say, I'm going to put that into a script include rather than just allowing the code to sit where the code sits, I promise you in the long run is going to pay off in spades. I promise you. I've been down this road. I've been down both pathways. Putting things in script includes is always the better answer. And even though it may take 5 minutes to create that script include and put the code in that script include, you'll thank yourself in the future, right? Whenever you have to maintain it. So yeah, keep everything. And the way that it helps reduce defects is that it's only defined one place. And so once you've had that code tested thoroughly, it's tested thoroughly. And there's not 10 different places where you may be trying to do the same thing that you need to keep in your mind to say, I need to go update those things and make sure all of them are up to par with what the latest and greatest is on changes that we've made per the customer's request. So you change it in one place, that one place is already tested. Now you only have to test that one place again, because if that function is always going to produce the same value or values, then your downstream things are going to work if you've already accounted for that from that one piece of code that you're changing, right? So overall maintenance and defects just really get cleared up as you build a library out like this. Okay, cool. And so that I'm kind of coming to the conclusion here, right? So, there's the DRY principle. When DRY is adhered to, it minimizes defects and reduces overall development effort. Thus, if you keep your code base organized by using the DRY principle, that's just one of the principles, but by using the DRY principle, your code base is going to have less defects and take less effort to maintain, just by principle.
Hey, David, can I give a real world example of this?
100%, sir.
So I was tasked with creating basically a custom app, and it ended up having like 3 different parts to it. One which was a widget, one was a backend load-in, an import set. And this principle actually saved us because we had specific code that had to push stuff through IRE, Identification Reconciliation Engine. And we ended up having to write basically the same code in 4 different areas that all had different update methods happening. So by putting it into a script include, a lot of what you just called out here was actually saving us overall, because, you know, when we had to make one change, we didn't have to do it in 4 different places, right? It also helps when you had like 3 or 4 different people doing different things. I had Sarah doing the UI side, myself doing the load in side, and someone else doing it elsewhere. We had one place where I could control that specific expertise block that I knew how to do, right? So it really, 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 really helped.
Yeah, great example. And you know, the danger in that as well is that if somebody doesn't have a full picture, the complete picture of what's going on architecturally with that project that you're working on, which not everyone always does, then there is the chance that duplication can occur because, you know, person B just doesn't know that person A already created that function. So this is why team communication during a project, during an implementation, is absolutely critical. And architects passing down their vision to technical consultants is absolutely key. So if you ever have questions, I would say always search the script include code base first to see if anything's out there. Sort by updated. You'll see stuff that was created by your team. You'll see stuff that may adhere to what you're trying to do here. And I would look into that thoroughly before moving on with creating something. Talk to the architect. Hey, does this sound good? You know, like, do we have a need to make this a bigger script include with different functions in it? How should I structure this? Right? Rather than just putting stuff in a business rule or elsewhere, you know, UI action or business rule where server-side code is called. I would make the argument that if you're not calling Glide system or other native APIs to ServiceNow directly, and that's all you're doing, then you need to put it in a script include. And that's excluding Glide records, because I will say, I think Glide record calls should always be in a function. And if they're in a function, that function should probably go into a script include. One of the reasons I say Glide records should always be in a function is because then you don't have these nested Glide record calls that become so problematic. And there's no problem calling your Glide record GR if it's within a function that is named properly. You don't have to worry about what the name of that Glide record is, right? That's something that I see on LinkedIn constantly, and I just completely disagree with it, that the problem that people are having has nothing to do with what they're naming Glide record. It has everything to do with how things are structured. You know, don't put GR1 and nest GR2 and GR3 inside of that GR1. That's going to lead to major problems, I promise you, every time. So that's the purpose. That's why we're here. So now we go into some principles. These are where I get really opinionated. So, you know, I'm a firm believer in that good and respectful conflict is a great thing because we all come out better from it. So, you know, if we have things that you guys want to, that you disagree on, let me know, please. Okay, so I say always build script includes as classes rather than single functions. I already mentioned this. And again, this is because the nature of script includes is to be a repository, not, if it can be a single function, and ServiceNow does this all the time, especially their legacy code, which I guess I can, you know, sort of brush off as legacy code. But a lot of their reference qualifiers and things like that are single functions, and it just seems so inefficient and so difficult to maintain. Make a reference qualifier script include, right? Make a reference qualifier class that allows you to do reference qualifiers for ITSM, you know, maybe call that ITSM ref qual, right? And then put tons of reference qualifiers all within that one script include. And now you know what to call every time you need a reference qualifier for something that's ITSM. It's probably in there. If it's not, you add the function, right? So a class should contain functions that make sense in the context of the class as well. So if I have a class called user group and I'm doing things associated with the user group table, such as inserts, update, get, things like that from that table, I'm not going to put a get user by ID function in there because it doesn't make sense in the context of that class. What does make sense is having another script include called user that allows me to get the user, and I know get user by ID is a Glide system thing, but it allows me to do things that are user related. I can then use that script include within my user group script include as a reference. I say as a reference, calling it so that it's only defined in one place, and everything within the user group script include is themed or, you know, has that common context of user group. All right, put everything in a function. Like I said, everything that's not native. So like if I'm in a UI script and I need to, update a state, I can do current.state equals whatever, current.updates, set my redirect. That's all native code. That's all in the API. That's perfect. Let's do that. I don't need to define that anywhere else because ServiceNow already has all of that defined. Outside of that, if it's not something like, let's say I need to do processing on some record behind the scenes, that should absolutely be broken out into a script include because you'll likely need it somewhere else in the future or now. Okay. So when you think your function is small enough, make it smaller. That goes into this next idea of that a function should do one thing and it should do one thing very, very well. So if you have a function to create an incident, that's all that function should do. It shouldn't first do validation on 50 fields and then create an incident. You should have a function that you pull out of that to say validate, incident data, and then call that first within that create incident function. So that makes sense because validation code may not always make sense right off the bat, but it makes sense if it's packaged in a function that's named properly, right? So it makes sense being in the other function, and your function is still only doing one thing. Ultimately, it's only creating the incident. It can abstract things outside of that core function, like doing the validation. The check on validation has to happen as part of the creation, but it doesn't have to happen in the same function as the creation. Okay. That's probably a bad example, but we'll go through code that I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. So if that code can be broken down into any sort of logical blocks that aren't 100% related to what you're doing in that function, break it out into a new function. And then that broken out function, if it has a theme or a context or a theme that doesn't make sense where it is, break it out into its own script include so that now you're really complying with, because, for instance, the validate incident data, right, that I just used as an example. Well, that could likely go into its own script include called incident validator, something like that. Naming is so difficult, by the way, but incident validator, because I'm going to have other code that is going to create incidents at some point as well. And I may need to validate different fields. So why don't we make that a new script include that takes in a parameter to say what I need to validate, and then make that a validation class all by itself. And then pass that into the incident script include to where it can be used, and it can be used multiple times, right? Yeah. So write functions that do a single thing. That's a lot harder than it sounds. I know not everything I write is like that. It can't be, because sometimes you don't realize that you're actually mixing things up. But that's why we are constantly refactoring as well, right? Constantly making our code better. So when we go in and we're maintaining our code and we realize, oh, why the hell did I do that? Well, I can change that. I can rather than just continuing to maintain something that I know is wrong, I can fix it. So I don't have to fix it. Make classes as generic as possible so they can be reused throughout your library. Now, that's not going to be true of every class. Some classes are going to have to be very specific, but they should be built upon classes that are very generic. One of the classes that I'll show you is one that I've built and I've used with multiple customers that allows me to more easily get and work with glide records. So rather than, every one of my script includes having, 5 or 6, let's say I have 5 script includes that all correspond with the table, right? Let's say incident, change, problem, where I'm getting at. Each one of those then has multiple functions in it: update, create, get all, whatever, right? All of those functions. Well, why would I do a glide record call in each one of those when I can just abstract that glide record call out somewhere else and call it as one single line in my script includes? And then everything where it's abstracted to is tightly controlled. I know I'm not going to hit any errors because I've coded it that way, that if something fails, it's going to fail silently, or it's going to throw an error, and I know when it's going to throw an error, right? So I know how to handle everything that I'm doing from that code. That's also a way to get around APIs that are third party that you have no control over, right? So one of the things that I'm going to show you in my code is a couple of comments that I added just because it's a ServiceNow API that just by the name of it, you can't really tell what it's doing. So I add a little comment. But another way around that is to encapsulate that in a function that does tell you exactly what it does, right? Because it doesn't matter what code's called within that function. As long as the function name tells you what it does, then you're good. You're in a good place. Okay. So anyway, make classes as generic as possible for what they're doing so that they can be reused. Okay. Naming, I hate naming. And I don't know, it's the worst thing that we do. It really is. And it takes the longest time if you're doing it right. You know, anyone can put a 2 on the end of something or a 3 on the end of something, but that doesn't tell me what your intention is. Tell me what your intention is. Please tell me what your intention is. And please don't abbreviate unless it is an industry recognized abbreviation. Config, that's a great industry recognized abbreviation. GR is a great abbreviation, but you know, calling your parameters that you're passing in A, B, and C, except for sort, you can do that when you're doing a sort function. Outside of that, that just doesn't make any sense. I don't know what A, B, and C are, right? Or, and there's no,
Hey,
no
David.
purpose. Yes, sir.
Can I make one suggestion also?
Yeah.
You'd be so surprised how often I see misspelled variables and stuff
Oh yeah.
in code. And it's really embarrassing when it's like somebody who's on our team and we find it. But like I see it so often, and who knows, maybe I even do it too, but
I'm sure we've all done it. No doubt.
even like checking the spelling on your own variables and stuff is good to do.
So the flip side of that,
thought
though,
into them. Oh, go ahead, Dean. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, so the flip side of that is when you don't notice that and you write like 400 lines of code, it can be very difficult and kind of sketchy to go back and fix that, and because you're afraid you're going to actually create defects, right?
Find and replace.
So, and that's exactly what I do. But there are those times where you're on like the 5th update of a functionality you put in, and one time, like the 3rd time, you cause a defect because you were just rushing too much. And then it starts to get in your head a little bit like, okay, I see this, but this is such a minor change, and will it end up causing a defect somewhere else because I don't notice something, right? So I agree with you, spelling's really important, but if you've already built something out and something's misspelled, don't make it a priority to necessarily go in there and just fix that one spelling for the sake of doing it, right?
I would disagree. I feel like refactoring should be like a Scrum activity in development. You know, you're always going to like have, so I don't want to derail this. Sorry.
No. Yeah, I mean, I think both.
It'd be fun to take this offline, Robert.
I lean more towards what Jeff is saying, that I will fix it because my OCD will actually make me itch through my skin if I leave it like that, most likely. But yeah, right. I mean, not only abbreviations, but yeah, there are misspellings when you see a misspelling. And you know what, if you're really paying attention to how you're naming that variable, you're probably less likely to have a misspelling, right? One thing that actually brings to mind is, aside from just abbreviations, some people also sometimes put names in there that just have a different letter, right? Like instead of class CLASS, since that's a reserved word, let's use KLASS. Well, that's just not a good idea. There's probably a better way that could be represented than just putting a K, right? So be as descriptive as you possibly can. And when you look at it, if you don't initially see, oh, I know exactly what that is and what I'm trying to do there, probably rename it. Probably say, how can I make it something that I understand at a glance, right? Because remember, the goal here is not to build code for yourself. It's to build code for the person coming behind you, who you have no idea what their skill level is going to be. You have no idea if they're going to know what a ternary operator is. They likely won't, right? So try not to use those, right? Okay, so the good tried and true noun, verb, class name, function name has always proven to work well. There's going to be exceptions to that, but that's typically the way to go. I don't like to see, and ServiceNow does this a lot. Like if you throw util at the end of a class name, does that give me any extra information at all as to what that thing does? I know utility methods in some languages like Java, they do make sense because they actually have a purpose, because a utility method is one that doesn't have to be instantiated. It's one that's already instantiated for you whenever you pull it up. And that has a definition, but in JavaScript, it doesn't, right? And in ServiceNow, it definitely doesn't. So if you're putting manager on the end of your class name or util on the end of your class name, there's probably a better way to say exactly what it's doing. Or if it's user util, why not just call it user, right? Because, and by the way, I understand that for purposes of not colliding with other code, we do need to put prefixes on a lot of these. Typically, we ask the customer what they want for the prefix on their script includes. And if they don't want a prefix on their script includes, I'll usually throw something out there anyway, because I don't want my stuff to ever collide with what ServiceNow has built either. Okay. Sometimes I'll just throw GF on the front of it for GlideFast. So, but anyway, manager, util, things like that, just, try and think of better ways to name them at the end of the day, because every function or every class can be looked at as a utility, right? It's what it's doing. It's doing code. Code is utility. So, try and be really descriptive with that. I say this is probably gonna be controversial, but I don't use comments unless I absolutely have to. I did see that it was mentioned in chat about JSDoc, and I agree with that. If you're adding comments to do documentation on your class and functions, that is valid. And JSDoc is great, but if the customer requires it, it's great too. But I also still believe that you can name your functions and your classes in a way that tells people exactly what they're doing without having to break it out into 10 lines of JSDoc documentation, right? And the little comments where it's like, hey, this is doing this. Well, if you can write a comment for that, you can also just break it out into a function with a name that tells you exactly what it's doing, rather than writing that. That's going to make your code more concise. It's going to make your code more maintainable. The comment doesn't do anything for you other than add context where you could probably do it a different way, which is why I say comments. I do have a couple examples of comments, like I said, that I used in the code that I'm going to show everyone, but I probably wouldn't use those real world. I did them just as an example. I'd probably break those out into functions that are named properly rather than doing them as a comment. Okay. All right. So I think that's all for principles. Yeah. Okay, cool. So first off, just for anyone who doesn't know, script includes are in the platform. Type in script includes, come in here, and you get a whole library of scripts. Let's just go into one of them real quick. It's a read-only one, so I can't do anything with it, but you can see that it's a class, right? A class named Global Service Catalog Util, and each one of these functions within it is a function that you can call on that class elsewhere in the platform. I don't think we need to go any further into that. That's how it's structured, okay? Let's talk code. So first off, I want to show you a somewhat different way to write JavaScript. ServiceNow uses the prototypal format like this. I use a different format typically, and I'll show you the difference in the two. So ServiceNow, the way ServiceNow does things is the prototype. They actually have this method that they've created for creating a class behind the scenes, and it makes it seem like it's a class. There's, JavaScript doesn't really have real classes. JavaScript has fake classes because JavaScript is all prototype. It's a prototype language. It's not an object-oriented language, but that's for another day. So anyway, this is how ServiceNow would structure a user class that has get by email, get by full name, get by last name, right? I like to write mine. I create them as an object rather than as a prototype. And what advantage this gives me is that I can have true private methods, right? So if I create a function here, get first name from or by full name, right? Full name. Now, let's see, return full name. We'll just do a split on a space and say, give me the second index. Okay. Now I could call this now and say, get by full name here. I don't know how I could use this. This is just something I came up with on the fly. Anyway, I could call this in another one of my functions in here, right? Because it's private. Unless I return it in the return statement up here, it's not public. People cannot call it on your function. Over here, if I create that same function, which looks slightly different, but it's close. Let's do that real quick, right? So I need to do, so over here, this has a naming convention that has an underscore on it, but it's not private. The naming convention allows it to be private, but I can still call it, right? Because it's not truly private. Over here, it's truly private. So just I prefer to, now Ajax ones still need to be written this way. I'm sure they could be written the other way, but I just haven't put time into that because I don't need to. So the Ajax ones are typically still written the same way as ServiceNow writes them. No, whenever I write them. So that's just an FYI. If you see that, I wanted to show you this because you're going to see my code is typically like this, and I don't want to confuse anyone. It's still a script include. It still does the same exact thing as script include does. It's just formatted a little bit differently. Okay, close all. Okay, so here's my library, and this is the library that I built for a project for hardware asset management. It was branded like it had the prefix on all of the names, but I removed them all because if this is going out online, we don't want to put customers out there, customer code out there. So yeah, you'll never know what customer it is. So I want to talk about a couple of the principles I was talking about first. First off, I want to talk about more generic versus less generic script includes. So I'll start with the one that I kind of used as an example, which is my most generic script include of all, which is this glide service. I use this a lot. I put it in most of my customer instances just as part of my code base to work on, because it allows me to do glide record calls in one line. I know that glide query is out there, and that's new. It came out after I had built this, so I got used to using this. I find this to be easier. It doesn't do as much as glide query, but it doesn't need to do as much as glide query. It does all of, it does 99% of what I need to do on a glide record from this one class. So very simple: insert multiple, which pulls multiple, remove single ID. So this pulls single by sys-ID, this pulls single by query, and update. Right, so they're all very, very simple, and I'll show you how I'm using them. And then I've got some private methods in here as well, where I'm, initializing or creating a glide record. I'm populating a glide record with data from an object, and then I'm forcing things to arrays, or I'm forcing things to objects, or I'm setting field values. But you never see those, right? You never see the implementation of any of those private methods. You just see the ones that are exposed publicly, the ones that we showed at the top. Okay, so to show you kind of how that works, let's go to the hardware. Right, so hardware has some functions as well. And these are things that I built that would make you act upon some sort of hardware asset record. Things that you do in workflows and things like that that you may need help along with. So I don't want to define the assignment code for an asset in every workflow that may do an assignment. So rather than doing that, I define it here, and then I call hardware, new hardware assign, pass in the hardware sys-ID and the user sys-ID, and it happens for me, right? So this is done in one place. If logic changes, or I need to, change different values or whatever, I come and add those here rather than redefining it anywhere. We're using that glide service here at the top of the script include and calling it hardware service. So I know hardware service has all of these methods that we looked at before on glide service. So the update, insert, single ID, multiple, and I can call those in a single line. So this gets me a hardware asset, but not as a glide record, as an object, right? So this is just an object that has the property or the name of every field followed by either value or display value. And so whenever I call it, if I want to see where hardware asset is used here, I can see I'm using it here, hardware asset.install_date.value, and that's getting me the install date. And I know that it's always going to have a value, even if that value is blank. It's not going to be undefined because I'm making sure of that in the code for glide service, right? So I know what I'm always going to expect from glide service. I'm sorry, yeah, glide service, that's right. So that's an easy way to call one line glide record calls, and then single line updates as well, although it's not single line, but I'm passing in an object, so it is actually single line because it's only one object. But here I'm doing an update. So the way update works is I pass in an ID, the sys-ID of the record. And remember, the service is based on the table name. So these are always going to act on that one table, ALM hardware. So update goes to pass in an ID, and then each of these represents a field. So on the back end in glide service, if it finds the field doesn't exist, it doesn't do anything because the field doesn't exist. But all the property names match with fields that it'll get written to whenever I call these update methods. So each one of these, again, just changes state, right? Maintain, reserve, retire, stock, transfer, unreserve. I don't know if that's a word, but that's what I called it. That puts it back into available and in stock. So all very, very useful methods that can be used in the workflow or business rules or wherever you're going to use them throughout your implementation. Consumable is very similar. It just has one method, consume. Now, this is kind of an example of what I was talking about where you can break things out into different methods. So consume, first thing I'm doing is getting a consumable, the consumable record based on a query, right? I want the ones that have an install status of available, I'm in stock and available, where the model ID and the stock room match what I've passed in. Once I get my consumable, I then could have gone and created a bunch of spaghetti code for what I need to do with that consumable, but rather I did this, I broke it out into multiple functions. So the first thing I need to know is, hey, is the requested quantity less than the available quantity? So let's just call the function that rather than putting a comment there. Is the request quantity less? If it is, I'm going to update that available consumable and I'm going to insert a new consumed consumable, right? Because consumables kind of work that way. They decrement until they get to zero. But if You decrement one that's in stock, you need to create a new one that's assigned to the user, because that's just how it works. That's how consumables work. But else, if the requested quantity is not less than the available quantity, I'm just going to update the new consumable. Okay. So all of these are broken out into functions that make more sense than they would if it was just done in line in the same function. And so that's what I wanted to show there. Could these be broken out more? Possibly. I mean, this one's probably doing more than one thing right here. You know, I could probably break this out more, and I could definitely put a semicolon. So, you know, there's always room for improvement. I'll probably refactor this at some point just because I like refactoring. Okay, so import set's kind of similar. It does an import set, loads an import set from a source, removes attachments from the data source, then adds an attachment to the data source and processes it. And I added a couple comments here just to show you what I mean. This is GlideFast attachment copy. I don't know right off the top of my head what that does, maybe. So I put a little note here that says it copies all attachments. So I want to make sure copy is copy all, actually. So I put a little note in there because it's not my code. It's a third-party code. Now I could have wrapped that in its own function, which I kind of did here. And it does say copy attachments, I know, but you see what I'm saying. I did this because I wanted to show you guys. And then here again, transform worker set background, that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me what that's doing. So I put a little note in there to say that makes the transform run in the background rather than locking things up. Okay. So just little examples. I want to show you this. We're down to 13 minutes. I could talk, I know, I'm sorry. But I want to show you guys the REST API one that I built here and how it works with another thing. So I have a very base script or class here. It's kind of like Glide service, but it's for REST APIs. I've probably worked with this with a few of you. You might recognize it. Very simple. It is for a basic authorization REST call. And I just created a class here that has all 4 of the most commonly used REST API methods. So get, patch, post, and remove. Each one of those is a function that calls execute request and passes in the method, as well as any information that may be needed, right? So get passes in the endpoint and the method, but patch and post pass in payloads. And then each of these functions calls execute request, and execute request knows how to handle each one of them, right? So no matter what, I'm always going to get an object out as a response. It's either going to be a parse response or a parse error. Either way, I'm getting an object that has a status and either a message or a body. So I know I'm never going to get a crappy, message from the REST server. I'm just going to get my own messages packaged up exactly as I would expect them, so that whenever I call this, I can call it in a much more structured way, in a way where I don't have to do a bunch of spaghetti code with try catches and error handling and all that good stuff. So yeah, if there's a payload, it sets the payload, stringifies it and sets the payload. It then executes and then parses the response or the error. So that's it. This is used. I use this all over the place. One example is in the CDW API. This customer needed an integration with CDW. So this isn't actually the code I used for the customer. I think Sheck built this. I just adapted it so I could show you guys as an example. It's got one function, create order, right? So you may have defined this as create order as a REST message in ServiceNow. I feel like those records, the REST message records, kind of box you in, because if you change them, you have to change your code if you're referencing anything. And I just find it easier to do the REST call strictly in code. And also, whenever you have a REST message defined and you go from prod to test or test to prod, you have to change the endpoint. You might have to change the endpoint, right? So I like to do it in code. So create order passes in a requested item that I know is the hardware requested item that we're requesting of CDW. We have a basic auth ID. The sys-ID of that basic auth is stored in a system property. So we're passing that into our REST API, which is the class I just showed you, which I don't know if I showed you that. All it takes in up here is a basic auth ID as a parameter. So pass in the basic auth ID. We then call post with the endpoint that we've provided right here. And we have a function to build our payload, because putting that in here would have been giving it more than one concern, right? So builds a payload based on the requested item, variables, and things like that. This could be broken out more, I know for a fact, but I think this is still a good example of utilizing a more generic script include with a less generic script include. Okay, and then I just have a few like user preference, which is just doing get value, set value, and user preference. These you could use everywhere. I know there's already APIs for user preference, but they differ between global and scoped. And they also have one on the client side that works, I think it works on Portal, but not, outside a portal or something like it's just inconsistent. So I called them with this, and I use the Ajax call that supports that one, that calls the same functions from user preference, set value and get value. So I always have consistency with getting user preferences or system properties. So I'll typically bring these into projects that I'm working on anytime I need to get these pieces of information. Okay, and then variable Ajax is just getting variable information for some other use. I can't remember exactly what I'm using it for here. Oh, and I did want to show, I have the least generic script include right here, and it's big. I would definitely argue it's too big, but it's also one of those things that Frankensteined out, right? That you start building. So what this is I think of scripts as a flow, right? Starting with the most generic being Glide service, it's used everywhere, and then going into more less generic. And this one is the most specific. This has functions in it that only pertain to requested items that have to do with hardware. So I have variables in here. I have variable values that I need to get. If you can think of having multiple items like order hardware, install hardware, probably not a good example, but order, I don't know, another one, reclaim, something like that, right? So you have all these things that you can do with hardware, order or get back. Well, business reason is something that they required for all of their different ones, but there was different values based on what type of item it was, what type of catalog item it was. So what I'm doing down here for get business reason is I'm saying, if it's a hardware assignment requested item, then return me this variable. If it's a hardware collection, which is they were collecting it back, then give me this variable. And if it's a consumable request, give me this variable, right? So what this is that it channels, I can call get business reason anywhere I want to call get business reason, and it's going to automatically figure out for me which business reason I need. And I can be confident, because I know this is what I built, that it's going to give me a value or a blank string, but it's going to give me the value that I need based on what the catalog item is. And so rather than calling, get business reason for hardware assignment or get business reason for hardware collection, I could call the same function in all of those different workflows, which allows me to make the workflows more generic as well, right? So based on if at the beginning of the workflow, I collect what catalog item it is that this is related to, I now can call this function get business reason one time, and it's going to calculate what it needs to get because I know what catalog item, what requested item I'm passing into it. Hopefully that makes sense. But I do this a lot with especially with large requests, because it's just very, very like get model with hardware. There's so many ways model could be set in all the different ways that we were doing this, all the different catalog items we had here. But get model is always going to get me a model because it's based on what type of item it is. So not generic at all, but that's okay, because that's its purpose. It is as general as it can be for its purpose, which is serving information or serving process to a hardware requested item. Okay, and I think that's it. I have 5 minutes. I talked all the way up to 5 minutes. So questions? I can talk for another 5. Hey, yeah. Hey, Jody.
So I agree with a lot of what you have said today. So, disclaimer noted and all that kind of stuff. But most of what you have said is perfectly valid within the bounds of you have an instance and you're trying to come up with a good or advise a customer on a good way to maintain that instance and the code that goes into that instance. But what about, existing instances for which we do contract work? How do you recommend this specific type of organization strictly within the bounds of what we are contracted to do with a particular customer, particular instance, as opposed to like a ground up or advisory type, thing for the instance?
Yeah. So I probably wouldn't change my strategy too much if it was if it's a maintenance thing and not a build from scratch. But I would definitely try and get my bearing of what is already in that customer's instance, because if they already have some classes that you could leverage and you don't have to create as part of your library but could bring into your library, then you definitely want to do that. A good example is FIS. FIS has built a ton of stuff, right? Like prior to us, and I know I reuse their stuff all the time. I find a method that they're doing. I make sure that, first off, I make sure that method is doing exactly what I want it to do. But then a lot of times I'll encapsulate that method into my own method because I just want to remain consistent with how I'm calling things, but ultimately still using the code that already exists in their code base. So I would just say be very cautious before you create things. Make sure you've vetted everything that's out there, and there's not something already out there doing what you need it to do. And if it is, and it does, and it's not exactly as you want it, I'd make the argument, let's fix it and get it exactly as we want it, and then adopt it into our code base.
Is there any guideline that you have or whatnot for how much time we're allowed to allocate towards examining what they have? Because anytime we
Yeah.
spend, we have to bill hours for it. So,
Yeah.
and it's not, especially if it's not something that we're actually under contract to build,
Sure. You know what? And if that's the case, so if going out and searching for, 5 or 10 minutes to try and find something that is going to take, hours to build, it's worthwhile, in my opinion. I don't have guidance on exactly what that may be. I will typically, when I know what my code is doing, like I know the fields that it's updating, things like that, or I know the tables it's updating, go search through all the script includes through the script field and actually search for that field or search for that table name and see what comes back. See if any, and obviously I'm not going to look too far into the stuff that ServiceNow created because I typically know the lay of all of that already. But look at the stuff that customer has created or other consultants have created prior to you, and just do a little digging. I wouldn't put too much time into it though. If let's say you already have a code base built out, I would probably, if it's something very complex, I'd probably just use my code at that point. Because you're right, it could be prohibitive actually doing that search. I think it's a case-by-case basis though.
Exactly. And that's why I was asking, for the benefit of the recording and everybody else was listening, because I was thinking the same thing. Ultimately, yes, if we're managing an instance, if you're working for a customer full-time, then all this matters. But for our work in particular, we're on a contract, we have limited hours to accomplish the mission. You're going to have to weigh it every single time. Is it worth it to encapsulate everything we do into a set library that is specific to what we were contracted to do just because it's more time efficient? Or is this one of those contracts where we're at the mercy of the customer, it's whatever they want us to do? And so really it's in the customer's best interest for us to learn their code base and build within it or expand it, as needed.
Especially when they have a good process in place, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, I agree 100%. 100%. It is always a case-by-case basis. This is very general. Yeah. Awesome question though. Thanks, Judy. Time's up, but anybody else have anything? And you guys please reach out to me one-on-one or in a group chat or whatever if you guys have questions that come up. I appreciate everyone attending. Go ahead.
I was curious if you are calling your script include the same manner as you would with a prototypal.
Yes, exactly the same. New name of the script include dot function name. Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Okay, excellent. Thanks everyone for your time. I know everyone has meetings to get to, so everyone have a great weekend if I don't talk to you. And thanks
David.
again. Yeah, definitely. Thanks.